What's up, everybody? How the hell are y'all out there? For you repeat listeners, the balance of punk rock fury and chops in addition to groove is a sought-after combination of skill sets that I've always personally tried to incorporate into my own playing. And if there's a drummer out there that typifies said combination of skills, it's got to be today's guest in Blake Fleming. Blake's worked with such groups as the Mars Volta, Laddio Bolocko, Zinni Giva, Dazzling Killmen, and many more got him voted into Spin's 100 Greatest Drummers of Alternative Music, and rightfully so. But Blake and I get into his great new book, The Book of Rhythm, and the tedious process of its initial phase from notebooks to seeing it finally printed. As well as his work with the aforementioned groups, his formative years of drumming with Fife and drum corps and Scottish bagpipe bands, and early records that were being played in the various rooms of his house growing up. Plus Blake's experience of living in New York in the 90s in what seems to have been a bygone era. Check out the links in the description to keep track of Blake's projects and even get yourself a copy of the Book of Rhythm. Shout out to my sponsor, New Orleans Record Press. If you're looking at releasing vinyl, go on over to NewOrleansRecordPress.com to check out packaging, mastering, electroplating, lacquer cutting options, as well as real-time quote generator. And they print both 12 and 7-inch records in both 150 and 180 gram variants. And no shortage of ridiculously beautiful vinyl coloring options as well. Need assistance with the design or have further questions? Give them a holler. And that's NewOrleansRecordPress.com. So here we go. The one and only Blake Fleming, y'all. Book of Rhythm out now. Get you a copy. Crash, bang, boom.
Crowds go mad with joy.
All right, Blake Fleming, what's happening, man? How you been making out, dude? It's been a long time.
Hey, Jody.
Yeah, I haven't seen you in person, I think, since the last time I took a drum lesson with you, and that was easily 5-6 years ago, maybe longer. I don't even know.
Yeah, it might even be a little bit longer. It was a while ago. I know I was not living in Brooklyn any longer at that point. I was
Correct.
in upstate New York, and I had come down for something in the city, and we were able to hook up. But yeah, that was a while ago for sure, a number of years ago.
Yeah. And the time before that, I'm realizing you were in, I think, like Brooklyn Heights, living in like you had a basement where you had all your drums set up and cracked cymbals everywhere, and that was like the first lesson I took with you, and that was some years prior to that, I believe. Jesus, it's been a long time.
That was down on Columbia Street for all the renovations and all the reconstruction and all that stuff down there, when it was still, a bit more rugged.
Right.
Yeah, and that was enough, because that's when I was still living in the city. So that was probably anywhere between 2005 and 2008, maybe something like that.
Yeah, I came to New York in 2005, post-Katrina, and I think I probably had a lesson with you within those first couple of years. So yeah, it could have maybe, I would say 2007-ish.
Yeah, I was still there for sure.
Wow, that is crazy. Well, congrats, man, on the book, The Book of Rhythm, I should say.
Thank you.
Just peering over it, I just got it a few days ago. I haven't really had the time to sit down with it too much, and I'll definitely let you speak far more to that. But I like the broad sort of rhythmic umbrella of it, so to speak, in that it can apply not only to a drum set, and it's not drum set specific music, but it's actually just about learning rhythm, period, and about permutating rhythms, and the number of variations and options thereof within that book are something someone could spend a lot of time on. So I'm curious to pick your brain a little bit about that, because my God, man, that's a hell of a collection of work. Good Lord.
Yeah, it took me about 13 or 14 months straight working on that, and then my wife joined in. She was probably on it with me, full time for maybe about 9 months, like as far as doing layout and logistical stuff, and just every little step of the way in a process, in a project like that, there are just numerous hurdles every day. The smallest thing of, the most innocuous thing of like, well, wait, how do we make a period? It's like something so simple would become so complicated sometimes. But yeah, it was a serious process. I started that in November of 2017. I sat down to start writing a book of some sort, and at first I thought it was going to be kind of my own drum method sort of book, how I got from A to Z kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I just started writing in a notebook, which I've always done. I'm kind of old school in that way. I always carry notebooks with me, and I'm always writing in notebooks. And
Yeah.
so I just started writing, anything that came to mind musically and or otherwise, And about 5 weeks into it, I started coming up with some ideas. And after a little bit of investigation and a lot of thinking and a lot of trial and error, I started kind of finding this system for developing all these rhythmic patterns. Basically using the concept of like, permutations and combinations. And so I stumbled upon that by end of December of 2017. So from December of 2017, when I actually really started work on the Book of Rhythm, until we turned it in sometime, I think, just after the new year, January 2019. That whole stretch there. So all of 2018 was working on the book. Because I wrote the entire thing in 2 notebooks first. I wrote it all out by hand first in 2 notebooks, and then had to transfer all of that information into a notation program, and then transfer all the notation into a layout program.
Oof.
And getting all of those things to work together, and not really being super familiar with much of that, it could be very daunting at times. And there were definitely times, when I felt scared and I wanted to cry and curl up in a fetal position, what have I done? And
I bet.
But I had gone so far that there was definitely no turning back. And it just became something that I believed in and my wife believed in, and a few close friends that I had started telling the idea to, they believed in it, and so we just pushed forward. And it was a real lesson in learning how to take things on a day-to-day basis and be able to put things into bite-sized chunks for yourself. It's something that I do for students and teaching all the time. That's one thing I have to do as a teacher, is I have to put the information into nice bite-sized chunks for them to be able to process it all at the right time, instead of becoming overwhelmed and frustrated and then not wanting to do something.
Right.
So learning how to do that for myself over the course of such a large project like that was just, it was invaluable, and it was completely imperative to this project, because I kind of have a process of zooming in and working on the day-to-day and working on every little task at hand, and then being able to zoom out and see the overall picture, like, seeing the forest or just the tree kind of idea. And
Yeah.
I found that, once I learned to zoom in more and more and just kind of focus on, okay, here's a couple tasks I need to do today. Let me do that. And then the next day, let me do that. And after a while, a few months later, you'll look behind you and there's all of this stuff that you've done.
Yeah.
It was a learning process and a growing process in a number of ways. It's finally done. It's just now starting to make its way out into the world. Actually, I think there's 160 of them out in the world right now, or soon to be out in the world. And that was from the pre-orders that we had with the book. So now that people actually get it in their hand and we start doing some promotion and stuff for it, I'm hoping that it can become a very ubiquitous thing, and we can move a lot of books. It's something I definitely believe in.
Yeah.
I'm kind of on the edge now because I really put myself out there.
Yeah, you
like,
did.
As far as like time and emotion and also financially. So it's we've got a good amount riding on it, but it's also something that we really believe in. And I don't know. I'm definitely like a kid with it. Like I just like to pick it up and look at it and hold it and just thumb through it and just, I kind of marvel at it. And I definitely got a whole new appreciation for books and the construction of books by doing this. I mean, there's so many things in the world, like most things in the world, right, that we just walk by every day and not really realize how in depth things are and how certain things get to be in the form that we know them as.
Well, let me ask you this, because, from studying with you, I know that you had always had these sort of built-in blocks and systems, so to speak, where you could sort of go up a particular idea and then come back down a particular idea. So I know you'd been working on this stuff for quite some time, having studied with you. But one thing that I never really asked you was, what was your background studying? Were there any particular drummers that were imperative in your early years? And did you take specific drum set lessons? And how'd you end up playing the drums?
I started taking lessons on the snare drum when I was 8 years old.
Okay.
And before that, it was a very typical, little kid drummer kind of thing of just banging on pots and pans. And there used to be these really large, they were like these plastic gallon tubs of ice cream that my mom would get sometimes from some store. And once those were empty, those could make some pretty good drums. They sounded pretty good, and they weren't quite as harsh sounding as the pots. So I could go to town on those. And then when I was 8 years old, I started taking lessons from my neighbor, basically. This girl I was 8, she was 16. She lived down the street from me. There was an organization in my town, the Alton Colonial Fife and Drum Corps. And it was a group of kids, middle school and high school age, and actually myself and one or two other kids grade school age, who did Revolutionary War music, traditional fifing and drumming music. And it was very, very cool. And it's all rope tensioned drums, and the snares are 2 feet high, and the bass drums are gigantic, and you can feel them in your chest. And it just
wow,
there was something about that I loved, and just the energy of music in general. I had felt, very profoundly from the time I was a kid, because there was always so much music being played in my house. My parents had a turntable. I had 2 older brothers. They both had turntables, and they were all playing different things. Like my parents were playing, classic country, Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson and Patsy Cline and things like that. Oldies, 50s rock and roll, Fats Domino, Elvis Presley, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
My oldest brother was playing progressive rock and classic rock, and my middle brother was playing like punk rock and new wave, and that was all going on at the same time. And then I was taking like my Kiss records and playing them on my little suitcase turntable, and
right.
like, freaking out to Destroyer and dancing around my room, and then like having to put my records away at night because they would scare me, because they were devil worshippers, all this crazy stuff, and
yeah.
And that stuff used to freak me out, right? And
yeah,
I remember hearing the intro to Don't Bring Me Down by ELO that starts with the drums. And
oh, man, I love ELO.
That used to give me literal goosebumps, and still does, and it would make me, as a 5 and 6-year-old, would make me just freak out. I would just turn into primitive, like Monkey Man or something, and I was just something that I just felt it on a very visceral and emotional level, And so my parents saw this, and after a trip to the zoo with these neighbors of mine, I was riding in the back seat of the car with my neighbor Sarah, and she was the drummer, and we started talking about stuff, and she was like, you should take some drum lessons. And I was like, man, yeah, maybe I should take some drum lessons. And then I talked to my parents about it, and a week or two later, I had my Haskell Hard Book 1 and my 2B sticks, and I had my little slanted wooden practice pad for traditional grip, and I was ready to go, man.
Yeah.
And so I was so lucky, man, because this organization was great. The Fife and Drum Corps, the kids were made to sound like professionals, and it was treated very much like a professional organization. We traveled around the country, especially a lot in the summer, playing parades and reenactments, and we had done like car commercials like out in Washington D.C. over 4th of July, and played on the steps of the Capitol, and
Wow.
played for like Reagan and Prince Charles, and all kinds of stuff. But we played for Reagan's birthday, which was up in Dixon, Illinois, which is where he's from, which is right around Chicago.
Interesting.
And he happens to be born like the first week of February.
Mm-hmm.
It was an outdoor parade, and it was literally below zero.
Oh.
It was three below zero.
Oh, man.
And a bunch of us got frostbite, and minor to a couple having extreme versions of frostbite. I had just a very, very minor version of it, but
Oh my
we
God.
did this like 2-mile parade and like stopped and played for Ron and Nancy, and they're like in this heated little glass booth or whatever, and we're outside
Those assholes.
dressed as like Revolutionary War military people, freezing our butts off.
Dying of hypothermia.
Yeah, I mean, so from an early age, like I had some pretty wild experiences playing and performing for people, and starting to tour, like getting in a van with a bunch of people and going somewhere. That's what we did in the Fife and Drum Corps.
Right.
So I grew up learning how to read, how to count, and knowing my rudiments and stuff, and I had I had pretty decent hand technique because I was so lucky because my neighbor Sarah, she happened to be a great teacher.
Huh.
She was great, and then once I got into the Fife and Drum Corps, there was usually 6 of us playing snare and 2 or 3 playing bass, 15 or 20 fifers, a color guard, and a drum major. Mm-hmm. And we had this guy Jerry Whitaker moved to town, and he was the East Coast rudimental snare drum champion from West Point.
Wow.
He was like this serious dude. He happened to move to our area, found out about our Fife and Drum Corps, and became our instructor. So I'm like
Whoa.
10 years old, and I've got this guy teaching me snare technique, with 5 or 6 other snare drummers,
Wow.
and it was incredible, because the drum line needed to sound like one drum,
Yeah.
So we really worked on stick heights and technique and the openness of our strokes and matching everything, and it was super intense, and and a lot of fun. But I did that until I was about 12, and then I got my parents pulled me out of that because I was having a little bit too much fun at my age, if you get my drift.
Right.
Because there was a lot of older kids, there was a lot of high school kids in there, and I grew up around. I had 2 older brothers, so
Yeah.
like I knew my way around,
Yeah.
to a degree.
Yeah.
And after this one trip to D.C. and some stuff my parents found out about, they were like, "Okay, yeah, you're 12."
Right. Yeah.
It's time to go, brother. So, that broke my heart for a little while, but I got over it. And a couple years after that, I got into a similar organization, but this was a Scottish bagpipe band, the John Ford Highlanders,
Oh, wow.
based out of St. Louis, Missouri. And these were guys that I had known, as acquaintances, because we would appear at some of the same reenactments together that I did when I was in the Fife and Drumming Corps.
Yeah.
And they were cool guys. I liked them. They were fun. And the ironic thing is they partied way harder than the kids in the Fife and Drum Corps, because these were all old Irish and Scottish dudes. Like a couple of the guys were World War II vets. This guy
Whoa.
Kenny that played the tenor drum. Kenny landed on the freaking beach at Normandy.
What?
Okay, these guys were serious. Yes, yeah.
Oh, man.
These guys were serious. So they were all quite old, and so there was me and a couple other kids. The head piper, the guy that led the group, he had 2 younger boys that were my age, basically.
Yeah.
One was a piper and one was a drummer. And there was a couple other kids, and then the rest was these old dudes. And we would go and play parades and reenactments and like VFW functions, and we played like the Orange Bowl parade, in Miami one year, and on TV, and stuff like that. And it was a lot of fun, and there was some crazy experiences. I got to do some traveling. But also just the drumming itself. I mean, that Scottish snare drumming was very syncopated. There's a lot of, it's all like buzz rolls, a lot of like, dotted kind of notes. So it's very, very kind of swung, but like a very tight kind of swing. And I love that, but between that and the Fife and Drum Corps stuff, that music is actually between the snare and the bass drum is actually quite syncopated.
Right.
And it really kind of helped inform a lot of what I started doing once I got a drum kit, and that was when I was 12. My parents came home with this Tama Swing Star. It was a complete surprise to me, and which of course, just blew my mind. I mean, it was just, it was one of those things I would just lay around the room looking at my drum kit for weeks on end, taking pictures of it and polishing it, and I was like a super nerd, man.
Right.
I was so in love with it. And I was 12, and I would play along with records and tapes, and I'd play along with tapes by the Clash or like the Jam or the Psychedelic Furs or the Sex Pistols, Blondie, the Ramones, like a lot of the 70s and early 80s kind of new wave and punk stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was kind of into at that point, and that's kind of what I was playing. Yeah. And when I wasn't doing that, I was just kind of mimicking fife and drum corps stuff or bagpipe band stuff between like the snare and the kick drum, and trying to get these working together with those syncopations, and after a while, I was able to kind of add the hi-hat, and then after a little while, further, I would start to revoice what I was doing on the snare. I'd start to maybe split it between the snare and a cymbal, or the snare and a tom or something, and all of a sudden I could start to hear the separate rhythms in each hand, and that just kind of went on, and my style kind of developed from there. But it really all came from this, a very traditional military style drumming background, which is, where like a lot of the early jazz drummers, that's where they came from, because that's what drumming was before jazz.
Right.
It was orchestral or it was military, and the military stuff had more punch to it, so guys would gravitate towards it, and those rhythms would end up being used in the jazz idiom, or ragtime and Dixieland and stuff. And
right.
That's kind of where I came from. It was like a military drumming background as a kid, and then growing up with all that stuff I told you that I was hearing in my house. That all kind of fed its way into me kind of figuring out what I guess my voice was going to be on the instrument.
Well, I guess that kind of segues us into the early 90s. You were pretty young when you were playing with Dazzling Killmen. And that's interesting, I guess, if you were in Illinois with some proximity to Chicago, because really some of the only bands that I could think of that had some influence to my ear, at least, and I'd be curious to hear what your side of the story is, would be maybe some of Steve Albini's bands or something, whether it was like Rape Man or Shellac, or I can hear some of the Jesus Lizard and what y'all did, but I always thought y'all actually had a little bit more in common with some of the New York noise bands like Unsane and stuff like that, because that sort of aggressive and angular and like abrasive approach with really, really, of course, but then your drumming was really an interesting component with that. So I guess what were some of those influences when you started doing Dazzling Killmen?
It was a mixture of things, of course, and there was bands like some of the early SST bands definitely played a large role. The Minutemen were a big one for all of us. And
George Hurley's a bad motherfucker.
Oh, he's great, man. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I just loved that band, and I think I was 15 whenever Darren Gray and I met, Darren the bass player.
Yeah.
And we were playing in a community college jazz band together. He was taking some classes at the college, and I was a sophomore or junior in high school. And we met through that, and we started getting together on weekends and jamming and improvising. And, he was turning me on to a lot of stuff musically. And then when I met Nick Sakes, who Darren was giving guitar lessons to at the same time that Darren was jamming with me, we kind of all three got together at one point. And those guys, being, I think, 5 and 10 years older than I was, something like that.
Wow.
I think Nick is 10 years older than I am, and I think Darren is 5 years older than I am.
Mm-hmm.
They turned me on to a lot of stuff, especially a lot more underground things, like the Minutemen and, Black Flag and De Kreutzen, Slovenly, Saccharine Trust, Universal Congress of,
Yeah.
And then I had been listening to a lot of stuff myself, and I had gotten into jazz at a pretty young age from my first drum set teacher, who gave me a bunch of records to listen to and said, you may not understand this stuff now, but keep listening to it and you will, and trust me, I think you'll even like it. And I ended up falling in love with it. And so Darren was getting into jazz as well. So it was kind of this mixture of underground independent, punk rock, experimental sort of music mixed with jazz in a way. It's kind of what we started off doing, but we never set out to purposefully mix that stuff. It's just kind of what we were listening to and what was kind of coming out naturally. And we kind of always thought of it in a way as almost like a proggier version of Black Flag or something.
Yeah.
And we had that sort of insular gang kind of vibe a little bit. We definitely felt it was us against the world sometimes.
Sure.
The romantic notions that you get when you're in a band and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The things that really provide glue for a band too. You need to have those, whether they're delusional or not. It's important for solidarity. But yeah, we were listening to The Birthday Party and PIL, Cecil Taylor, Albert Eiler, all that kind of stuff getting mixed up. And then, bands like Can and This Heat coming in, the Sun City Girls. But essentially at the root of it, it was kind of early punk rock and hardcore, the early SST stuff mixed with avant-garde jazz. And then at the same time, like Darren and I were getting into 20th century classical music, and then Tim Garrigan joined the band as the second guitar player, and then the band took on a whole other life. So that band really evolved.
Yeah.
In the few years that it was together. I mean, it started off being a kind of progressive punk rock kind of thing, and then ended up being this more, I don't know. There's something kind of atmospheric about the last album, Face of Collapse, that is not present in the earlier work. So I feel like through Tim coming in, things were starting to get more sophisticated as well. It was kind of like the energy and aggression of hardcore and punk rock mixed with like the technique and agility of jazz. That was kind of it in a nutshell, or at least the way that people would end up describing it.
Yeah. And how old were you when you first started playing with them?
When we did the first 7-inch, Numb and Bottom Feeder, it was in the summer, and I think it was just before my 18th birthday. But I was in my my later teens.
Right.
I think I was 16 or 17 when we actually first started getting together, me, Nick, and Darren. And I believe I was 17 when we did that first 7-inch, something like that. Yeah.
I think the first record that I heard from y'all was Face of Collapse, which came out in '94. So, God, you were in your early 20s, but I remember thinking, man, this drummer is killing. And I had like my one buddy. I feel like he was the one guy that turned everybody onto that record. Like he brought it over to one of my parties, and we went into my room, and he's like, "Dude, I have to play you this." It's so funny. It was one of those things, and it was totally you playing.
It's like the party's over.
Totally. Well, thankfully, I had an isolated room where we could go listen to that and not drive everyone at the party fucking crazy by it. But
Gotcha.
But I do remember thinking that this drummer is ripping, and it's wild to think that you were in your early 20s playing that stuff, man. That's pretty wild.
When we recorded Face of Collapse, I was 1 week into being 21.
Wow.
And I remember that very, very specifically because Nick Sakes had introduced me to Jose Cuervo at Steve Albini's house.
Oh, boy.
When Steve's studio was still in his house. Anyway, I was in a neighborhood of Chicago. I had finished recording all the drum parts, and I went out and did some celebrating.
Oh boy!
And ended up, doing some embarrassing things. But I was a week into my 21st birthday when we made that record.
At some point, I guess, Dazzling Killmen dissolves and you end up moving to New York, and then you start Laddio Bolocko. Is that what happened, or did the Mars Volta precede that? How did that, what's the timeline there?
So Dazzling Killmen, we split up. Nick, the singer, he had kind of reached the end, and it was unfortunate timing because it was 2 weeks before we were going to Japan for a tour with our friends in the band Zenigeva.
Yep.
So that never happened, and so I spent about a year and a half not really playing with anybody. I had this loft space in the downtown of my hometown. Mm-hmm. It was my practice space and where I was living most of the time, and I just taught drum lessons and played drums. That's all I did. I dropped out of college, and most of my friends had gone away to college. I did not go away to college because I was in Dazzling Killmen, and then that fell apart, and then all of a sudden I was kind of in my hometown with not too many people around. So I spent a bunch of time in the woodshed at that point, and that was, I was, I guess, 21, 22 years old, something like that.
Yeah.
Between 21, 23. I had been wanting to move to New York City since I was young. It had been a dream of mine, and that was the plan. I was just kind of working on saving up the money to do the trip. And at some point, the Japanese band Zenigeva had contacted me because they had lost their drummer in Japan and were coming to the States to do a 2-month tour for a new record that they had on Jello Biafra's label, Alternative Tentacles.
Yep.
And we had toured with those guys in the Dazzling Killmen days, and we really liked each other, and they really liked my drumming, so they wanted to know if I would do the tour with them. And I said, yeah, that would be great. I love you guys, and it'd be great to go around the country with you guys for a couple months. At that point, they were like a double bass oriented band. It was very kind of metal oriented, and I said, I don't play double bass, mm-hmm. but I can compensate in other ways,
Yeah.
And they ended up really liking that version and wanted me to stay with the band and move to Japan, but I was moving to New York City just after that tour.
Oh,
but
wow.
A lot of people liked it, fortunately. It kind of gave them a less metal vibe and a more just like harder, I guess, kind of just aggressive punk rock kind of vibe or something. I don't know. But it was a great time, and it gave me the last little chunk of money that I kind of needed to get myself out to New York City. So in the summer of '96, I moved to New York City. And before I moved to New York City, I had been playing a little bit with Drew from Laddio and Ben from Laddio, because we're all from the St. Louis area, but on the Illinois side of it. And we had a trio for a little while, kind of like a little progressive improv kind of rock experimental thing going on. And I moved to New York City, and I started playing with Marcus DeGrazia, the saxophone player who later became the saxophonist in Laddio Bolocko. Marcus and I had a duo together. And then a couple months after I moved, Ben and Drew moved. So I had a drum and saxophone duo, and then I had this instrumental rock trio that was playing. And one day, I was like, I think we should probably all meet.
Yeah.
And see what happens. And so I basically fused the two groups that I had, and we formed Laddio Bolocko. And that was in, I guess by probably I guess maybe 96 going into 97.
Right.
Is when Laddio Bolocko formed, because we didn't record our first album until the summer of 97.
Mm-hmm.
So basically that band got together. It was a fusion of the two groups that I was playing in. And for a while, we used to rehearse in the basement of my apartment building in Brooklyn, because we had it all to ourselves, and it was only accessible through my apartment.
Is that the one I took the lesson from you at?
No. This was in Williamsburg. This was the first place I lived at like South 3rd and Half Mile.
Oh, right on. You've had two places where you had basement access and you could jam and do all that in Brooklyn?
Yeah. Oh man, I was so lucky on
Wow.
the New York scene in those ways. Like I just had this way of like finding places that I could be loud in. I don't know.
Holy shit.
Yeah. I got lucky there a number of times.
I can't
actually.
believe once is almost impossible, twice is unheard of.
Yeah. At that point, New York was still It wasn't like present day New York still.
Yeah.
And this is pre 9/11.
Right.
And there were still sketchy enough parts, and there was neighborhoods had not been gentrified yet. When Laddio Bolocko, when we lived in our practice space in Dumbo in 1997, there was no one down there.
Right.
After 5 p.m., that was a ghost town,
Right.
and you could run around naked, which we literally did sometimes, just because we could. For that, we would like go on our roof and play like frisbee naked and stuff. I mean, it was like we'd go like grab some 40s, literally, man, and like just. Or run around the street just because we could, like make like weird videos, and because it would literally empty out. It was a complete ghost town.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
But yeah, that band formed then, and it was what we did in that group is we like sometimes Ben or Drew or Marcus, a lot of times it was Ben or Drew initially would have some sort of idea or riff that we would jam on, and we would just jam and improvise a lot, and then we would kind of take the best bits of those improvisations and jams and start to sculpt them into songs, but the songs in the case of that band, with the exception of on record, were very elastic. I mean, live,
For sure.
They were vehicles to launch us into improvisations that would hopefully take us and the audience on some kind of journey,
Yeah.
So it was never the same live set, and that was one thing that people liked about that band a lot. It was exciting, but
Yeah.
on record we tried to be a bit more concise, and we it sounds funny when you actually hear what the band sounds like, but for us we were actually almost thinking in terms of like we're a pop band when we made records, like we're doing these really traditional song forms and all this kind of stuff, so we thought.
That's hilarious.
It's just our tastes were just so different than the status quo that we thought that Faust was a pop band, which they are in a lot of ways. It's just it took people some time to catch up to that kind of stuff.
Wow.
But yeah, we were definitely pretty extreme, and we lived together as a band for the first couple of years. We almost lived together as a band almost the whole time we were a band.
Wow.
And we toured on top of it. I mean, we were
God.
like the Monkees on steroids. Like it was. Yeah, it was intense, but I think that's definitely something that added to the overall oeuvre and energy of that music.
Sure.
We just had this tightness and closeness because we literally were so tight and close in our living quarters.
Wow.
And that takes a toll after a while, and that can only stay a positive thing for so long. But we wrote it for as long as we could, and then like all those things, it just ended up kind of falling apart.
Let me ask you this: when y'all were playing around in New York, in particular, like local shows, were there any particular bands that you felt like were kindred spirits and that y'all played shows with necessarily, or were y'all kind of always the odd man out?
We were, for the most part, the odd man out, but we had some kindred spirits. Like we were buddies with the Heroin Sheiks, mm-hmm. and Norm Westberg from the Swans. He was in that, and John Fell was playing drums, and my old buddy George Proferius, who is no longer with us, unfortunately, he was in that band, and We did some stuff with those guys. We did have a peer group that we just didn't know of really at that point in the band Oneida. You know, those guys were kind of, they didn't sound like us. We didn't sound like each other, but we were kind of drawing from a similar kind of pot, you know. But, you know, that was kind of a strange time in New York. This was the pre-Strokes boom,
right?
You know, when like New York rock and roll and all that kind of stuff was in a really weird place, and we were kind of just a weird anomaly and kind of a weird little pond to begin with. And so we didn't play around New York City a whole lot. We really thought of ourselves as like, I don't know, we were a band of the world. Not that we toured the world, but, you know,
yeah.
New York was where we lived, but it didn't feel like, oh yeah, we're home again. We're gonna do this awesome show. It was,
right.
You know, we were starting to draw some people there. You know, I guess our last show we were touring with Trans Am, but you know, we did a sold out show at the Bowery Ballroom. That was the very last show we did.
Yeah.
You know, but that band had a pretty brief but intense and powerful lifespan, I think.
Yeah, it's trippy, man. Just hearing you talk about a time where New York was a place where artists could live and take their art elsewhere. Talk about being indicative of the present time. That is no longer the scenario. It's not as if you can come here as an artist and figure it out.
Yeah, it's not conducive to that any longer.
Right.
You know, which is a real shame. I mean, I love New York, but I think a lot of what I love about New York is a version of New York that is perhaps no longer there.
Towards the tail end of doing Laddio Bolocko, was that when you ended up hooking up with the Mars Volta briefly, and or was Laddio dissolved at that point, and how did you end up even doing the Mars Volta thing in the first place?
Let's see, was this? It might have been the last tour of Laddio Bolocko. We did a month-long tour of the U.S. with Trans Am, and we did a 2-night run out in Los Angeles at Spaceland.
Okay.
And we met Omar and Cedric, who were at the drive-in at the time. Mm-hmm. We met them because they had come to our show and ended up they had never heard of us. They had come to see Trans Am, but they saw us and they ended up loving us.
Oh, cool.
So we didn't know who they were. We didn't know anything about their band, anything. It was just like, hey, who are these two dudes with the fros going to give us a place to stay? You know, it was kind of like one of those things. Like, okay, they seem okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, cool. They said they got room for us. Cool. All right, so they don't have a car, so they're going to ride back with us. So you know, we're riding back in the van to their place in Long Beach, and we're talking, you know, band life and tour stories and stuff. And they're talking about, you know, playing with like Rage Against the Machine and U2 and stuff. And we're like, what band?
Who
are
the
you guys
fuck are
in?
these
Who
guys?
Are you? Yeah, and they're like, oh, we're in at the drive-in, and it was funny because I think they were not used to it. It was like complete silence in our van. Like none of us, we had never ever heard of them. Like, because you know, at that point in Laddio Bolocko, man, we were, you know, anything mainstream or anything that was on the radio or anything approaching mainstream, it was just not on our radar. You know,
Yeah.
We were really insular, like music nerds at that point, and not listening to things like that.
Right.
And I think that is one thing that allowed those guys to kind of open up to us and feel comfortable. Is we didn't know who they were and we didn't care. We were hanging out with them at face value, you know.
Wow.
And so we spent 2 nights at their place in Long Beach because, like I said, we did a 2-night run there. And on one of those nights too, Jack Black ended up laying on the stage while we were playing, listening to us, which was kind of funny.
Whoa, that's bizarre.
Yeah, it was just like a random little tidbit. But so I had met those guys then, and then so we finished that tour. We come back to New York. A couple months go by. Laddio Bolocko's trying to make a record things are not going well because things personally in the band are starting to fall apart. And then eventually I pulled the plug on it. I couldn't do it anymore. I had tried for a year and a half to kind of keep it going, but there were certain personality issues that were going on that were only getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, and it was starting to really ruin my entire quality of life.
Yeah.
So I had to cut that rope, man. That was in January 2000. And so right after that, I called Omar and Cedric's place out in Long Beach, and their roommate Jeremy answered. Jeremy Ward, who was eventually in the Mars Volta and ended up putting a needle in his arm and dying at the age of 27, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Jeremy answered the phone, and he was always such a super nice guy. We just talked for a little while, and he's like, "Yeah, man." He's like, "Those guys are on tour right now, but I'll definitely tell them that you called whenever they call to check in." And so they got the message from Jeremy, and a few days later, Omar had called me from Germany. I believe they were in Germany with. They had this little side project called De Facto.
Right.
It was with Ike Owens and Cedric and Omar and maybe one other person. I can't remember, but they were doing a little De Facto tour and said they were going to come back to the U.S. and break up at the drive-in. Would I like to start a band with them?
Really?
And I was like, holy moly. Yeah, I'd like to start a band with them. That would be awesome. So they came back a couple days later. They made this big announcement. They break up at the drive-in, and like probably 3 weeks or so after that, like I had tickets to Long Beach, and next thing you know, I was living on both coasts. I was flying back and forth. I'd go out there for anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks at a time, and then I'd come back to New York for like anywhere between 1 and 3 weeks. And we just went back and forth like that, working on the band and writing all that early material and stuff.
Wow.
But so that happened just after Laddio Bolocko, and it came about because I had met those guys. I think it was on the last Laddio Bolocko tour that we had done with Trans Am.
Wow.
So they basically it was the conversation when Omar called was along the lines of, we basically want to start a band like Laddio Bolocko, but with vocals with Cedric.
Okay.
That was the initial description to me of what eventually became the Mars Volta. It was like, let's do something like Laddio Bolocko, because Laddio Bolocko was an instrumental band, and we want to do something. We want to do music like that, but we want to have vocals, because and this was all their words at that time. And I know especially Omar, he felt that the kind of more punk rock based music they were doing at the drive-in, I think he was starting to feel like it felt so old, it felt stale.
Yeah.
He felt like that path had been treaded upon enough, and was really wanting to explore some new territory. But I think something clicked when they saw us, and then something clicked with my approach to the drums not being typical, especially kind of in that band, and they gravitated towards that,
Right. I mean, I think from speaking to you and from listening to some of the Laddio Bolocko stuff, I think it sounds like a pretty good amalgamation of your all of your early marching band stuff and what you did and whatnot, and then somewhere along the lines, I guess you kind of getting into more African rhythms and that kind of like repeating figure kind of style of drumming, and then as well as the improvisation. So in hearing you say that, it does it makes sense that they would be into it, and also ultimately kind of what became of the Mars Volta and that style of drumming. I could see that, so that does make sense.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of that's where it started, at least.
In between, I guess once you stopped doing the Mars Volta with that initial run, and how long even did that go on? That initial phase where you were in the band?
I think between 6 and 8 months.
What did you end up doing after that?
I came back to New York, and I was married at the time. Well, that was my first wife, basically, and I had met her on I think maybe the first Laddio Bolocko tour of Europe.
Okay.
She was German, and so came back to New York. I'm married. She wanted to start getting into music, so we got her a guitar, and she started playing, and I had gotten a bass, and we were just like, okay, screw it. I mean, we're in an apartment together. Let's try to make some music together. If we can't deal with being in bands, or I was having trouble being in bands, or something, like it's not easy. So,
Right.
It's like instant band all of a sudden with your roommate kind of thing, or your wife or whoever.
Yeah.
So we started just playing together in our apartment. Me playing bass, which was kind of like a nice break, like to not be playing drums. I guess I kind of needed a little break mentally. And so I started, learning how to play the bass a little bit, and she was learning to play guitar, and we were just kind of, stumbling our way through learning some songs and learning how to kind of write music for ourselves in a way. And we eventually formed a band with Marcus from Laddio Bolocko.
Okay.
And Marcus ended up coming down and playing organs for us, like bass organs. We didn't have a bass player. It was kind of like the Doors, where the bass was in the organ and keyboard part.
Yeah.
And we formed this band called The Electric Turn to Me, which was kind of like a progressive psychedelic kind of pop band.
Okay.
And it was kind of like a slightly more proggy psych version of like Susie and the Banshees or something like that.
Yeah.
And we toured quite a bit, all over the U.S. and all over Europe, and made a couple EPs, and we're getting ready to start like a 5-week residency at the Delancey right before we broke up. So we were starting to draw some good crowds in New York, and but we had split up as a couple in the process, and we're going through divorce.
Oh.
And we had still held we still had the band together, which was kind of crazy, but we had also kind of had this like very zen adult kind of view of the way things had gone down and what they were, and so we're like, okay, well, we don't have to function like this, but maybe we can still function like this.
Yeah.
And that ended up falling apart in essence because of us, but Marcus, the keyboard player, had reached the end of his rope with that group.
Yeah.
And the goings on, and so he kind of pulled the plug on that. All these groups that I've been in, they were always the types of bands where you couldn't, if somebody quit, that was the end. You could not replace that person, because it was all about like a collective voice, and you needed each kind of special, every person was a special ingredient, and you needed that special ingredient. If that wasn't there, you couldn't replace it. Like it's calling for paprika. You can't replace it with cayenne or something or whatever.
Right.
It might be close, but it's not paprika. It's one of those things. So it was always so specific. So once Marcus left, that was the end of that band, and that was a big relief though for me as well. That was a weird period for me. That's why this is the first time I've really talked about that group ever.
Yeah.
Since then, I don't bring it up. It just because there's some personal ties to it, but it was a weird period for me. I was a little lost.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was kind of searching for my identity. Like, I had really gotten my identity solidified as a drummer in Laddio Bolocko. I really had found a voice, and all of a sudden that was gone.
Yeah.
And I didn't, it took me a couple years to figure out what or who or whatever my voice was again,
Right.
And so that period of Electric Turn to Me, even though we did do some good stuff, and it was an interesting, unique band, it was a kind of like a lost period for me.
Right. Well, what's interesting in talking to you about that, and I'm realizing it now, I think when I took that lesson from you, the first one that I was talking about down in the basement, I'm realizing you had just gotten back, you had rejoined the Mars Volta briefly, and then you were back yet again, and that is around the time when I had that lesson from you. And I remember you telling me a little bit about some of this stuff, and I remember thinking, man, I feel like Blake is going through some shit right now. Flash forward a few years later, when I studied with you again, you seemed like your spirits were in a completely different space. So I could tell you were definitely going through some shit when we first did that.
Leaving the Mars Volta in October of 2006, I think it was. That left a bit of a psychological scar on me for a little while, because I had kind of made it, quote unquote. I'd made it,
right,
to where like your relatives think you're not a piece of shit anymore.
Yeah.
That kind of thing where like where the status quo doesn't think you're a leper,
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I kind of got there, and the top in that particular instance was not for me.
Yeah.
I had gotten there in a situation that, I've had other friends that have made it successfully and have had mainstream success, and it's been good.
Mm-hmm.
I happened to experience mine with a very, very dysfunctional group at that time, and kind of always. I mean, there's a reason that the band goes through drummers in particular as well as much as they do. But I had kind of gotten there, and on the surface I had all this stuff like, oh my God, I'm making money, and I got endorsements, and people are calling my name, and I'm signing autographs, walking out of the LA Forum, and blah 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 blah.
Right.
But I was also at the same time kind of more lonely and miserable than I'd ever been because of various circumstances, and I really just couldn't wait to like get back in a little cramped van with my gang of people that I loved and go play for 10 people at a bar.
Right.
Like I really was longing for that. And so there was some circumstances that went down, and it had gotten to the point where like a line had been put in the sand, and I'm like, okay, I'm not dealing with this anymore. And I left, and it was one of those things too where like it just started me on a whole other journey. When I left the Mars Volta, that was the beginning of me becoming who I am, not associated with any particular band, but being able to stand on my own as who I am. That was the beginning of that. And ever since then, since 2006, so let's say, the last 12, 13 years, it's been a process of establishing me for me, and not just Blake from the Mars Volta or Blake from Laddio or whatever, but just Blake Fleming, period.
Your solo record, Time's Up, it kind of segues into what we were talking about earlier, about you sort of finding your identity. I thought it was really cool that you put out a solo record. So tell me a little bit about that process of doing that.
I was living up in the Catskills, and in this little bitty hamlet like Mayberry. It was so idyllic and beautiful, and I ended up kind of being like a not even really a caretaker, but I just kind of kept an eye on this little local country church that was there, because they only had church in it on like a quarterly basis, because the congregation moved to a few other churches because they had fused a few congregations to make it bigger, and so they moved from church to church. And so that particular church sat empty much of the year, and I had asked one of my neighbors at one point if they thought I might be able to use, because the church had this gigantic, huge, nice, clean basement. It was just empty, and I was like,
another basement. Look at you. You got another basement.
Yeah. Oh, dude, listen. I'm a drummer. I'm a rat. I'm a basement dweller. I mean, I'm a bottom feeder. That's how I grew up. It's like, what are you doing with all that noise? Get in the basement. I mean, that's like, that's my whole life. I mean, I am a basement dweller. I feel, I guess I feel the most comfortable and at ease in kind of a semi-dingy, dirty, concrete-floored basement. I guess it appeals to something in me. There's something raw there. But yeah, so I ended up moving everything down there. And so I had this whole kind of studio set up down there, and for recording, and I had a huge PA, and I was, just for myself, just doing my own thing, and I could go down there whenever I wanted. So I had I got a little small inbox, a little 2-input inbox, and Pro Tools I got from somebody. Like, I just, with 1 or 2 mics, just start doing some recording. I might improvise and hit an idea that I liked, so maybe I'll find the tempo, dial it in with a click track, and then I'll just play and jam with the click track for a while, and I would do this off and on for months. And what I would do is I would go back then to my house down the street, and I would kind of go through all the different improvs and jams and stuff, and I would kind of start to sculpt sections.
Yeah.
I would use the computer to help me compose essentially, it was one of those things, like when I was in between Dazzling Killmen and playing with Zinigeva and moving to New York, I started working on all this solo drum stuff because I've always been of the mindset that I'm a drummer. I can make music even if I'm by myself. Like,
absolutely.
I can make music on that instrument. Like, so it was kind of a natural progression for me to make a solo record of, like, well, I'm not playing with anybody right now. I'm living kind of in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
I don't really know anybody yet. Okay, I'm going to just start recording. And it was just one of those things that, and like writing my book too, I just found with bigger projects like this, as long as you allow yourself to just kind of take that initial step, put one foot in front of the other, it just starts to happen after a little while. It's always the initial little hump that we have to get over,
right?
That ends up derailing people from doing so many great things.
Sure.
And once I took the initial step, I just got so into it because I could leave everything set up all the time. So I could just go down there, turn on my equipment, and start recording.
Oh, that's awesome.
It was so ideal. And I had multiple drum sets set up so I could just go, I'm going to try a different sound. And then I would just go to a different drum kit, And I was only using 1 or 2 mics because that's all I had for input. And so I would just kind of move them around. And I would, that album was really about getting the sound to be like that at the source. Like all the sounds on that record, it all went into the computer sounding like that based on just how much gain I was using in the analog realm. Meaning I had one mic going directly into the inbox, so that was a condenser mic that's all digital or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I had a 57 that went through a 4-track first as a preamp.
Okay.
And then into the inbox. And with that 4-track as a preamp, you could crank the gain on that and get that really explosive, like shattering, really gnarly kind of distortion coming from the drums. And I would fine-tune that. And you could fine-tune it in a way to where you could bring out certain overtones.
Uh-huh.
Certain things would get really augmented depending on where you set the mic and how you set the gain. And so I just really started experimenting a lot because I had the time and the space. I experimented a lot with just positioning, and that record sounds like it does kind of even in its almost rawest form. Now it did get mixed, and it was made to sound better by a friend of mine who does that professionally, but my initial sounds are not, well, some of them they're the exact sounds that you hear on the record. They've not been embellished. It's been created at the source by, like I said, a very simple setup of mic positioning and the gain stage, and then tuning. Tuning whatever instrument I was playing to achieve a certain melodic effect or something.
Right.
Because the idea was to make a drum record.
Yeah.
Not a percussion record, like a percussion record, but not with any melodic percussion, like melodic quote unquote. Because for me, it's all melodic. But
yeah, exactly.
Not like not traditional like a marimba or something like that. So all kind of more just tonal, textural oriented percussion. And I wanted to make pop songs essentially, again quote unquote, or these pop like structures that had hooks.
Yeah.
But using only drums and percussion. And that was kind of the overall idea behind it. But I think that came about as just a natural progression of playing more and more accompanying myself more and more, as far as overdubbing goes. It's kind of like when you start a project like this book or a record or whatever. I kind of draw the analogy of it's like a block of granite. You got to start to chip away at it, and for a while it looks really kind of weird and amorphous and just doesn't look like much of anything. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, I can see a nose there.
Yeah.
And once you can start to see the nose, you can say, oh, there's some cheekbones there. And then all of a sudden, oh, there's a chin. And, all of a sudden, all this, so much gets revealed just in the process, And I think that's the thing that people got to remember as well as far as doing long-term projects like this, that it's got to be about the process. If it's only about the goal, you're going to be miserable and you probably won't get there.
Right.
But if you really start to fall in love with the process, it's something I mentioned in my book.
Yeah, I saw that.
Falling in love with the process is really that's the goal, because you end up achieving what you want much faster and you enjoy it a lot more because you immerse yourself in it instead of just looking at the carrot dangling. And so. I just fell in love with going down to my studio every day and just being this little mad scientist on my own, and then coming home at night and seeing what I had done and seeing what can I sculpt out of this particular block of granite that I made today, kind of thing. So I got it completed, and then I wanted to put it out on vinyl, so I did a Kickstarter campaign, and that went really well. It got funded really quickly, and I was able to put it out on vinyl. And the reason that the Kickstarter campaign was successful and it worked is because I had a finished product already done. I was not looking to, for someone to fund my idea that I had no prototypes of or something. It was like, okay, I made this record. You can stream it. It's done. You can hear it. Can you just help me now put it in this form?
Yeah.
And it was the same way that I approached my book, the Book of Rhythm. The book was basically done. Can you help me now put it into physical form? And I just, it's like a little aside, because I just see a number of Kickstarter campaigns or fundraising campaigns that fail because people don't have enough of the idea together yet. People get ahead of themselves. They become a little hasty. Part of it is, that desire for the dopamine rush to share your idea and to get that good feedback. But I learned very quickly that, okay, if I want things to succeed, I've got to sit back. You can't show your cards. You know what I'm saying? I can't remember what the hell the analogy is, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah. You got to know when to fold them and know when to hold them.
Exactly.
Or something like that.
This all goes back to Kenny Rogers. God damn it.
Exactly. Where's my whiskey?
The gambler. Here we go. Oh, that's funny, man. Well, Blake, shit, it was awesome talking to you. Obviously, once again, congrats on the book. Is there anything going on in 2019 or any particular recordings or anything that you've been working on that you're excited about?
Yeah, there's well, I mean, I have my book that's out now.
Yes.
And I gotta say it is available at blakethedrummer.com. I've got a trio of my own with an upright bass player and a piano player / organist keyboardist, and that's been great. We're doing a lot of improvising and really starting to kind of find our own language as a group. And there's some plans to do some recording with that. Towards the between August and December of last year, 2018, I got to spend a lot of time in the studio with Sean Lennon, helping him work on his next solo record.
Awesome.
He hasn't done one of those in I think 15 years or something like that. So that's super exciting. It was me and him and two engineers in this studio holed up in the mountains off and on for between August and December. It was great. It was a real thrill and just a lot of fun, and the music was awesome. I'm super excited about that. I hope it's going to come out. I think it's going to. I'm teaching live online lessons. I still teach people around the world via Skype. And now I'm working on finishing up an interview for Modern Drummer. They're doing 2 pieces. They're doing one separate piece in the magazine about the book, and then they're doing a more extensive piece online about my, I guess, overall career. So I'm really excited about that.
Cool.
Just trying to get the book out there, trying to promote it, making some new music with my trio, hoping to do some more work with Sean. We'll see. I don't know. I've just finished up doing drums for this New York City band Vajra.
Okay.
Who's really great. They're like a female-fronted, kind of Eastern-influenced, heavy sort of band. They don't sound like Tool at all, but that's kind of in that vibe, or like Isis and that kind of thing.
Right.
But very strong and heavy and also catchy.
Sounds cool.
So yeah, I just finished up doing that. Yeah, there's a few other records I've been working on from some people. There's this project called The Andretti, and that is a record coming out this year, and that's going to be awesome. It's all it's very influenced by like 60s spy thriller sort of soundtracks, and like, you know, like composers like Jerry Goldsmith and John Barry and Lalo Schifrin, kind of mixed with like Mr. Bungle and like Tom Jones and that kind of thing. It's very cool. So yeah, you know, I definitely stay busy, and you know, I've got a family on top of that. But my biggest goals, you know, for this coming year is to really get the Book of Rhythm out there. I believe, and I hope that other people will see. I think it could become a real staple. So we'll see. But so far so good.
Yeah, from looking at it, that's certainly something. Once again, I think having that broad appeal for so many instruments, and it's not so drum set or drum specific. That it just is rhythm, which is that sort of universal language, that could be a like, as you said, a staple for it. So I certainly hope that's the case.
You know, it's a big creative tool for people. That's I wanted to give people, like, here's all of these things to create with.
Yeah.
Now go and do it.
Yeah.
You know, go create.
Right on, man. Hell yeah, man. Well, Blake, it was great talking to you, man. We got to catch up soon. Best of luck in 2019. Again, congrats on the book.
Jody, thank you so much, man.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks to Blake for catching up with me. Get your hands on the Book of Rhythm. It's got no shortage of permutations and seemingly infinite options. Dude undoubtedly put the work into it. So check it out. We'll catch you on the next one. Crash, bang, boom.